They called him Ironside, not because of armor he wore, but because his enemies claimed no blade could pierce his resolve, no obstacle could break his will, no distance was too far to travel. This is the story of Bjorn Ironside, the son of legends who became a legend greater than his parents ever imagined. From the shadow of the most famous Viking in history to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, from a boy seeking his father's approval to a king who reshaped the known world, this is the saga of the explorer who proved that the Viking Age was not just about conquest, but about pushing the boundaries of the possible. This is the legend of Bjorn Ironside, the wanderer who sailed farther than any Norseman before him and returned with tales that would be told for 1,000 years. The year was approximately 796 AD when Bjorn was born in Denmark, though some accounts place his birth in Norway. He entered a world already shaped by his parents' fame. His father was Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary raider whose name was spoken in hushed tones from Scandinavia to the British Isles, a man who had achieved the kind of immortal reputation that most warriors could only dream of. His mother was Lagertha, the shield maiden whose very existence challenged every assumption about what women could achieve. A warrior queen who commanded armies and respect in equal measure. To be born to such parents was both an incredible privilege and a crushing burden that would define every moment of Bjorn's early life. Growing up in the household of Ragnar and Lagertha was unlike any childhood in the Viking world. Where other noble children learned that their roles were predetermined by gender and birth order, Bjorn watched his mother train alongside his father, watched her command warriors who followed not out of obligation but genuine respect. He saw a partnership between equals that defied every convention of Norse society. This would shape his own views on leadership, partnership, and what was truly possible in ways he wouldn't fully understand until much later in his life. His early education was comprehensive and intense. Ragnar, despite his many absences on raids and expeditions, took personal interest in his firstborn son's development. He taught Bjorn not just how to fight, but how to think like a warrior and a leader. Every sparring session came with lessons about reading opponents, understanding psychology, managing fear. Every story Ragnar told about his raids carried hidden lessons about planning, logistics, dealing with the unexpected. Ragnar was preparing Bjorn not just to be a warrior, but to be a commander, a strategist, someone who could lead men into the unknown and bring them back alive and wealthy. Lagertha's influence was equally profound, but different in nature. Where Ragnar taught tactics and boldness, Lagertha taught discipline and preparation. She showed Bjorn that success in battle came not from bravery alone, but from meticulous planning, from understanding your strengths and your enemy's weaknesses, from being better prepared than anyone else. She taught him that taking risks was necessary, but taking stupid risks was fatal. She drilled into him that a leader's first responsibility was to the warriors who followed them, that their lives were a trust that should never be squandered carelessly. But perhaps the most important lesson both parents taught, though neither spoke it directly, was that Bjorn would never escape their shadows unless he achieved something entirely his own. This realization came gradually, growing stronger with each passing year. Every time someone met young Bjorn, they called him Ragnar's son or Lagertha's boy. His own name, his own identity, seemed secondary to his parentage. This could have broken a weaker spirit, could have turned him bitter, or made him give up trying to establish his own reputation. Instead, it became the driving force of his entire life. When Bjorn was still a boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, the first major fracture in his world occurred. Ragnar and Lagertha's marriage, that legendary partnership of equals, began to strain and ultimately broke apart. The reasons were complex, involving Ragnar's growing ambitions and his decision to take other wives for political advantage, and Lagertha's absolute refusal to be one wife among many. For Bjorn, caught between parents he loved and admired equally, the separation was devastating. He had to choose which parent to follow, which household to join, knowing that either choice would hurt the other parent and alter the course of his life. He chose to stay with Ragnar, a decision that would shape everything that followed. Perhaps he believed that following his father would offer greater opportunities for the kind of adventures and achievements he craved. Perhaps he thought that as a son, his place was with his father in the traditional Viking understanding of family. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine leaving the larger-than-life figure that was Ragnar Lothbrok. Whatever his reasoning, the choice was made, and Lagertha returned to Norway while Bjorn remained in Denmark with his father. The years that followed were formative in ways both wonderful and difficult. Ragnar married Aslaug, who claimed descent from legendary heroes and brought her own complications to the household. She bore Ragnar more sons: Ivar, who would become known as the Boneless despite or because of his physical disabilities, Hvitserk, Sigurd, and Ubba. Suddenly, Bjorn was no longer Ragnar's only son, but the eldest of several, and the dynamics of competition and brotherhood became central to his development. His relationship with his half-brothers was complex and would remain so throughout their lives. With Ivar, there was constant tension. Ivar's brilliant mind and tactical genius made him formidable despite his physical limitations, and he resented any implication that Bjorn was superior simply because he was Ragnar's firstborn or because he had two working legs. With Hvitserk, Bjorn found something closer to genuine friendship, a brother who followed without excessive competition. Sigurd and Ubbi occupied different spaces in the family hierarchy, each carving out their own identities in the shadow of Ragnar's overwhelming fame. Bjorn's first real taste of warfare came when he was 16, joining one of Ragnar's raids against a Saxon settlement in England. This was a relatively small operation, designed partly to test Ragnar's sons, to see which of them had the temperament and skill for Viking warfare. The raid was successful, the Saxon defenders were overwhelmed, and wealth was taken. But what Bjorn remembered most was not the victory or the treasure, but the moment when he faced his first opponent in genuine combat, not practice but real battle where the other man was truly trying to kill him. The Saxon warrior was older, more experienced, probably fighting to protect his home and family. He attacked Bjorn with desperate fury, and in that moment, all of Bjorn's training could have evaporated in panic. But it didn't. He remembered his father's lessons about controlling fear, his mother's drilling about proper form and technique. He fought not with the reckless bravery of youth trying to prove something, but with disciplined skill. When the fight ended and his opponent lay dead, Bjorn felt not triumph, but a strange mixture of relief, nausea, and grim understanding. This was what being a Viking warrior truly meant. Not the glory of the sagas, but the brutal reality of taking another person's life to survive and prosper. Ragnar, watching his eldest son's first kill, recognized something important. Bjorn hadn't celebrated or boasted. He had simply cleaned his blade, checked on his companions, and prepared for whatever came next. This was the mark of someone who might actually survive long enough to become great, rather than dying young in a moment of stupid bravado. Ragnar increased Bjorn's responsibilities in subsequent raids, giving him command of small groups, testing his decision-making under pressure, seeing how he handled the weight of other men's lives depending on his choices. Over the next several years, Bjorn participated in numerous raids across England and Francia, learning the craft of Viking warfare through direct experience. He learned that successful raiding was not about mindless violence, but careful intelligence gathering. You needed to know when the target was most vulnerable, when defenders were few, when the weather would favor a quick strike and escape. He learned that the best raids ended with minimal casualties on both sides, getting in and out before organized resistance could form. He learned that the Vikings who survived to grow old were not necessarily the bravest in battle, but the smartest in choosing when and how to fight. But England and Francia, while profitable raiding grounds, were becoming increasingly dangerous. The kingdoms were learning to defend themselves, building better fortifications, maintaining standing armies, coordinating their responses to Viking attacks. The easy pickings of earlier decades were disappearing, and Bjorn, watching this change, began to think about what it meant for his own future and his own ambitions. He was in his mid-20s now, an experienced warrior and raider, respected among his peers. but he was still primarily known as Ragnar's son. Every raid he led, people compared it to what Ragnar would have done. Every decision he made was evaluated against what Ragnar might have decided. And while Bjorn loved and respected his father, he was growing increasingly desperate to step out of that enormous shadow and establish his own identity, his own legend. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Traders and travelers brought stories to the Danish coast of lands far to the south, beyond the Pillars of Hercules that marked the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. They spoke of warm waters and wealthy cities, of the remnants of the Roman Empire still rich beyond imagination, of opportunities that no Viking had yet exploited because the distance seemed impossible, the journey too dangerous, the unknown too vast. Most Vikings who heard these stories dismissed them as fantasy or exaggeration. The Mediterranean was impossibly far from Scandinavia. The journey would require sailing around the entire Iberian Peninsula, through waters that Norsemen had never navigated, past Christian kingdoms that would oppose any Viking fleet, facing storms and currents that were unknown and potentially deadly. It was the kind of insane, impossible venture that no reasonable person would attempt. Bjorn heard these stories and saw not impossibility, but opportunity. This was it. This was how he would step out of his father's shadow. Ragnar had raided England and Francia, had become famous throughout the known world for his exploits in relatively familiar waters. But the Mediterranean? That was unexplored territory for Vikings. If Bjorn could organize an expedition to these distant lands, if he could successfully raid the remnants of Rome itself, he would achieve something that even Ragnar Lothbrok had never done. He would become not just Ragnar's son, but Bjorn the explorer, Bjorn the far traveler, Bjorn who sailed where no Norseman had sailed before. He began planning immediately, but he knew this couldn't be a rushed or improvised expedition. The Mediterranean wasn't like raiding the English coast where you could sail there in a few days. This would be a journey of months, requiring supplies, ships capable of ocean voyaging, and warriors willing to venture into complete unknown for the promise of legendary wealth. He needed to be meticulous in his preparation, to plan for every contingency he could imagine, and some he probably couldn't. First, he needed ships, not the standard longships used for coastal raiding in England and Francia, which were optimized for speed and shallow draft, perfect for river navigation, but less ideal for extended ocean voyages. He commissioned the construction of larger, more seaworthy vessels, broader in the beam with higher sides to better handle ocean swells, capable of carrying more supplies for extended journeys, with reinforced hulls that could withstand the pounding of Atlantic storms. He consulted with the most experienced shipbuilders in Scandinavia, men whose families had been building ships for generations, incorporating their knowledge of what worked and what didn't in rough seas. The construction took months, requiring enormous amounts of timber that had to be carefully selected for strength and flexibility. Viking shipbuilding was an art form, each vessel constructed without written plans, the knowledge passed down through apprenticeship and experience. The shipwrights knew exactly which trees to choose, how to curve the planks, how to overlap them in the clinker style that gave Norse ships their characteristic appearance and their remarkable strength-to-weight ratio. For Bjorn's Mediterranean expedition, they pushed their craft to new limits, building ships larger than standard longships, but maintaining the elegant lines and superior sailing characteristics that made Norse vessels the finest in the world. Second, he needed detailed information about the route and the destinations. He sought out every trader who had traveled south, every merchant who had done business in Iberian ports, every slave who had escaped from Muslim territories and made it north, every Christian monk who had traveled to the Mediterranean on pilgrimage. From these diverse sources, he assembled fragments of knowledge, where fresh water could be found along the Iberian coast, which ports were lightly defended, where currents ran strong when storms were most likely, which Christian kingdoms might be bribed to allow passage, which Muslim emirates were distracted by internal conflicts and thus vulnerable to raid. He learned about the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Europe and Africa that marked the entrance to the Mediterranean. He learned that the tides and currents there were treacherous, that many ships had been wrecked trying to navigate the passage. He learned about the African coast, about the Moorish kingdoms that controlled it, about their military capabilities and their wealth. He learned about Sicily and southern Italy, about the Byzantine Empire's remnants, about the complex political situation in the Mediterranean that created both opportunities and dangers for raiders. This intelligence gathering was tedious and frustrating. Many potential sources knew little of value. Others demanded payment for information that turned out to be useless or wrong. Some were simply making up stories to seem important, or to extract money from gullible Vikings. Bjorn had to develop skills in evaluating sources, in cross-referencing information to separate truth from fiction, in building a mental map of regions he had never seen based on fragmentary and sometimes contradictory accounts. This intellectual work was as important as any battle he would fight, because mistakes in planning could doom the entire expedition before it even reached the Mediterranean. Third, he needed warriors. Not just any warriors, but men who could handle the unique challenges of this expedition. They needed to be experienced fighters, certainly, but also adaptable, able to handle long periods at sea, willing to venture into the unknown without guaranteed success. He recruited carefully, looking for men who combined competence with a certain recklessness, who saw the incredible risks but were willing to take them for the chance at incredible rewards and eternal fame. The recruitment was challenging. Many warriors were skeptical. The Mediterranean was a story, a legend, possibly not even real. The journey would take them away from their families and farms for perhaps a year or more. The risks were enormous and impossible to calculate. Death at sea, starvation, disease, battles against unknown enemies with unknown tactics. All of these were very real possibilities. But Bjorn was persuasive, painting a picture of wealth beyond imagination, of being remembered forever as the men who sailed with Bjorn Ironside to the ends of the earth, of achieving something that their grandchildren would still talk about generations later. He also recruited his brother Hvitserk, who enthusiastically embraced the adventure. Hvitserk lacked Ivar's brilliant strategic mind or Bjorn's driving ambition, but he was loyal, brave, and always ready for whatever came next. Having his brother along provided Bjorn with someone he could trust absolutely, a connection to family on what would be a very lonely and dangerous journey. By 859 AD, Bjorn's preparations were complete. He had assembled a fleet of 62 ships, each crewed by experienced sailors and warriors, carrying supplies for an extended voyage and weapons for whatever they might encounter. It was one of the largest Viking expeditions ever assembled, and its purpose was more ambitious than any raid that had come before. They were not just seeking to plunder nearby kingdoms. They were seeking to open an entirely new theater of Viking operations, to demonstrate that Norse capabilities extended far beyond anyone had imagined. The departure was a major event. The entire coast turned out to watch the fleet set sail. Ragnar was there, watching his eldest son embark on a journey that surpassed anything Ragnar himself had attempted. One can only imagine the complex emotions Ragnar felt. Pride in his son's ambition mixed with perhaps a touch of jealousy that Bjorn was about to achieve something beyond Ragnar's own accomplishments, and fear that he might never see his firstborn son again. The initial legs of the journey followed relatively known routes, sailing along the coast of what is now France and then down the Iberian Peninsula. But even these supposedly known waters presented challenges. Storms forced the fleet to take shelter, sometimes for days at a time. Supplies ran lower than planned. Ships were damaged and required repairs with limited resources. Several warriors fell ill. This was the reality of long-distance sea travel in the 9th century, a grinding test of endurance and seamanship that separated the competent from the merely brave. As they rounded the southwestern tip of Iberia and entered the Mediterranean Sea proper, Bjorn and his warriors found themselves in a completely different world. The Mediterranean was warmer than any waters they had known, the brilliant blue utterly unlike the gray-green North Sea. The coastlines were different, covered with vegetation that seemed alien to men used to the sparse forests of Scandinavia. The climate itself was a shock, the heat intense even in what locals considered mild weather. Vikings were accustomed to cold, to wearing heavy furs and wool. In the Mediterranean summer, such clothing was unbearable. They had to adapt quickly, learning to fight and work in conditions their bodies were not prepared for. The cultural shock was equally profound. The people they encountered spoke languages the Vikings had never heard, practiced customs that seemed bizarre, lived in cities more sophisticated than anything in Scandinavia. The architecture alone was overwhelming. Where Viking structures were primarily wood, built for function rather than beauty, Mediterranean cities boasted stone buildings that had stood for hundreds or even thousands of years, decorated with intricate carvings and mosaics that demonstrated levels of craftsmanship the Norse had rarely encountered. The local populations were equally shocked by the Vikings. To the Mediterranean peoples, these northern warriors were something from nightmare. Tall, pale men from beyond the known world who appeared from nowhere in strange ships, fought with terrifying ferocity, and seemed utterly unburdened by the civilized restraints that governed Mediterranean warfare. Where local armies fought according to established rules and customs, the Vikings fought to win by whatever means necessary. This cultural clash gave the Vikings significant advantages in the early raids, as defenders simply didn't know how to counter tactics that violated every assumption about how warfare should be conducted. Their first major target was the Moorish-controlled regions of southern Spain and North Africa. The Moors, who had never faced Viking raiders before, were utterly unprepared for the Norse onslaught. Bjorn's fleet struck coastal settlements with devastating effectiveness, taking wealth and slaves, burning what they couldn't carry. The Moors were sophisticated, civilized people with advanced military traditions, but they had built their defenses against land-based threats, not against seaborne raiders who could appear from nowhere, strike hard and fast, and disappear before organized resistance could respond. The raids were spectacularly successful, bringing in wealth beyond what most of Bjorn's warriors had seen in their entire lives before. Gold, silver, silks, spices, slaves, all the treasures of one of the richest regions in the medieval world. This success vindicated Bjorn's vision and cemented his authority over the expedition. He was no longer just Ragnar's son. He was Bjorn the Mediterranean raider, proving that his planning and his courage were worthy of his parentage. But Bjorn's ultimate goal was not the Moorish territories, profitable though they were. He wanted Rome itself, or at least what remained of the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. The eternal city, the center of the classical world, the symbol of power and civilization that had dominated Europe for 1,000 years. To raid Rome would be to achieve something that would echo through history, to attack the very heart of the civilization that had conquered most of the known world. The fleet sailed north into the Mediterranean, their reputation growing with each successful raid. They struck targets along the North African coast with devastating precision, learning as they went about Mediterranean defenses and vulnerabilities. Then they crossed to Sicily, the large island that had been fought over by Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, and now was controlled by various Muslim emirates. Sicily was wealthy beyond anything most Vikings had imagined, its markets filled with goods from across the known world. The raids on Sicily were particularly successful, but also particularly brutal. The local defenders, used to conflicts with other Mediterranean powers, were completely unprepared for Viking tactics. The Norse would beach their ships in unexpected locations, strike inland with terrifying speed, and be gone before organized resistance could form. They attacked the city of Mazara del Valle, overwhelming its defenses and taking massive amounts of plunder. They raided Syracuse, once one of the greatest cities of the ancient Greek world, terrorizing a population that had thought itself safe behind ancient walls. But Sicily also taught the Vikings hard lessons. The terrain was different from anything they knew. The heat exhausting, diseases unfamiliar and deadly. Several of Bjorn's warriors died not from combat, but from illnesses they had no immunity against. The local populations, while initially shocked by Viking tactics, began to adapt, organizing more effective defenses, using their knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes. The easy victories of the early raids became progressively harder as Mediterranean peoples learned to counter Norse methods. From Sicily, the fleet moved to southern Italy, raiding along the coast of what had once been Magna Graecia, the land of the ancient Greek colonies. They attacked Luna, a wealthy city that they may have mistaken for Rome itself, some sources suggesting that Bjorn believed he was assaulting the Eternal City when he was actually hundreds of miles north. This confusion, if true, demonstrates both the challenges of navigation in unfamiliar waters and the ambition that drove Bjorn to attempt what no Viking had attempted before. When Bjorn's fleet finally approached the Italian coast near Rome, they faced their greatest challenge. Rome, while no longer the capital of a vast empire, was still one of the most important cities in the Christian world, home to the Pope, heavily defended and symbolically crucial. The defenses were formidable, the garrison large and professional, the walls thick and well-maintained. A direct assault would be suicidal. What happened next became one of the most famous stories in Viking legend, though historians debate exactly how much of it is true and how much is later embellishment. According to the sagas, Bjorn devised an elaborate deception. He sent messengers to the city claiming that he was a dying pagan king who had seen the light of Christianity and wished to be baptized before his death. He requested that he be allowed to enter the city peacefully for this sacred purpose, bringing only a small honor guard. The church authorities, seeing an opportunity to convert a powerful pagan leader and perhaps prevent further Viking raids, agreed. Bjorn was carried into the city on a litter, playing the part of a dying man. His honor guard, armed but appearing ceremonial rather than threatening, accompanied him. They were brought to a church for the baptism ceremony. And then, in the middle of the ceremony, Bjorn leaped from his litter, very much alive and healthy. His honor guard drew concealed weapons. They fought their way through the surprised defenders, opened the city gates from inside, and let in the main Viking force that had been waiting nearby. The city was sacked, though accounts differ on how thorough the sacking was and whether they actually reached the inner city or only the outer districts. Whether this story is exactly true or a legend that grew in the telling, what's certain is that Bjorn's forces did conduct successful raids in Italy, that they took significant wealth, and that their presence so far south demonstrated a reach that terrified Christian Europe. Vikings were no longer just a northern problem. They had proven they could strike anywhere, even at the heart of Christendom itself. But success came with costs. The extended expedition had taken a heavy toll on Bjorn's fleet. Many ships had been lost to storms, some to combat, others to simple wear and tear from months of hard sailing. Casualties had been significant. Supplies were running critically low. Disease had ravaged some crews. And they were thousands of miles from home, in hostile waters, with every Christian kingdom between them and Scandinavia, now alerted to their presence and eager for revenge. The return journey was even more challenging and dangerous than the outbound voyage, testing Bjorn's leadership and his warriors' endurance to their absolute limits. They were sailing with fewer ships than they started with, having lost vessels to storms, combat, and simple attrition from months of hard use. The surviving ships were loaded dangerously heavy with plunder, gold and silver and precious goods that slowed them in the water and made them less maneuverable. They were exhausted from years of constant campaigning, from battles and raids and the grinding stress of being in hostile territory thousands of miles from home. Disease had ravaged some crews, strange Mediterranean illnesses that their northern constitutions had no resistance to. Scurvy from lack of fresh food had weakened many. Injuries from battles had left men crippled or in constant pain. And now every Christian kingdom between them and Scandinavia was alert to their presence and hungry for revenge. The raids of the past 3 years had terrorized the Mediterranean, and now rulers who had been caught unprepared were coordinating their responses, sharing intelligence, positioning forces to intercept the Vikings on their way north. The easy surprise raids of the early expedition were no longer possible. Every coastal approach was now potentially an ambush, every port a trap. They had to fight several significant battles along the Iberian coast against forces that had been mobilized specifically to intercept them and recover some of the stolen wealth. The Battle of the Guadalquivir River was particularly brutal, when a combined force of Moorish cavalry and infantry caught the Viking fleet while it was taking on fresh water. The ensuing combat was desperate and chaotic. Viking shield walls facing cavalry charges while other warriors tried to protect the ships and the plunder. Bjorn fought in the thick of it, his battle experience and personal courage inspiring warriors who were exhausted and might otherwise have broken. They held the Moors off, but the cost was high. Dozens of warriors dead or so badly wounded they died in the days that followed. Storms were another constant threat. The Atlantic in autumn and winter was treacherous, with gales that could spring up with terrifying speed. More than once, the fleet was scattered by storms, ships separated from each other, crews having to navigate by dead reckoning and luck to reunite. They lost ships this way, vessels that simply vanished into the gray vastness of the ocean, their crews never to be seen again. Each loss hurt not just because of the men and the plunder that went down, but because it reduced the fleet's collective capability, made them more vulnerable to attack, diminished their chances of making it home. When Bjorn finally sailed into Danish waters in late 862 AD, after more than 3 years away from Scandinavia, he commanded perhaps 20 ships, though estimates vary widely in the historical sources, and some suggest the number might have been even lower. Of the roughly 3,000 warriors who had set out with such hope and ambition, perhaps 700 returned. The casualties were staggering by any measure. More than 2,000 warriors had died far from home, killed in battles or storms or disease, their bodies buried in foreign soil or consigned to the sea. For a culture that valued dying in battle and being buried in familiar earth, these losses carried extra weight. But those who returned came back wealthy beyond imagination. Even divided among the survivors, the plunder from 3 years of Mediterranean raiding made every warrior rich. More importantly, they came back with stories that seemed impossible, tales that would be told and retold for generations, becoming part of the legendary saga tradition that would ensure Bjorn's fame long after his death. He was weathered, scarred, visibly changed by the hardships and battles he had endured. But he returned with incredible wealth, with stories that seemed impossible but were verified by the treasures he brought back, and with a reputation that would last forever. He had sailed farther than any Viking before him. He had raided the Mediterranean, something that had seemed impossible. He had proven that Viking capabilities extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. He was no longer Ragnar's son. He was Bjorn Ironside, the far traveler, the Mediterranean raider, the warrior who had proven that no distance was too great and no target too ambitious if you had the courage and skill to pursue it. His father, Ragnar, greeted him with visible pride. Whatever complicated emotions Ragnar might have felt about being surpassed by his own son, he recognized genuine greatness when he saw it. But Bjorn's adventures were not over. In fact, his Mediterranean expedition had only been the beginning of a life that would span decades and reshape the Viking world. While he had been away, significant changes had occurred in Scandinavia and England. His father Ragnar had conducted his final, ill-fated raid on England, been captured by King Ella of Northumbria, and been executed in the famous Snake Pit. The news had reached Scandinavia while Bjorn was still in the Mediterranean, and his brothers, particularly Ivar, had been assembling the great heathen army to avenge their father. Bjorn's return coincided with this preparation for revenge, and he immediately joined his brothers in planning the invasion of England. This was personal now. This wasn't about wealth or reputation. This was about family honor, about making King Ella and all of England pay for killing Ragnar Lothbrok. The great heathen army that assembled was unprecedented in Viking history, possibly the largest Viking military force ever gathered, and Bjorn was one of its principal commanders. The invasion and conquest of England from 865 to 878 AD is well documented in historical sources, and Bjorn played a crucial role throughout this transformative campaign. While his brother Ivar often receives credit for the brilliant strategic planning that characterized the great heathen army's operations, it was Bjorn who led many of the actual battles, whose experience in combat and command across multiple theaters of war proved invaluable time and again. His Mediterranean experience gave him perspectives that his brothers lacked. He had seen how different cultures organized their defenses, had learned to adapt to unfamiliar terrain and tactics, had commanded warriors in environments radically different from Scandinavian warfare. These skills proved crucial in England, where the Vikings faced Saxon kingdoms that fought differently than Norse enemies, used different fortification styles, had different military traditions. The conquest of York in November 866 stands as one of Bjorn's finest military achievements. The city was one of the largest and most important in England, heavily defended and considered impregnable by many. While Ivar conceived the overall strategy of waiting for the Northumbrian Civil War to divide the defenders, it was Bjorn who led the actual assault, commanding one of the three main attack columns that breached York's defenses during a heavy rainstorm. His ability to maintain unit cohesion and coordination in the chaos of urban warfare, skills he had honed in Mediterranean cities, proved decisive. The defeat and execution of King Ella was personally overseen by all of Ragnar's sons, but Bjorn played a particular role in the battle that led to Ella's capture. When the Northumbrian counterattack threatened to break the Viking lines, Bjorn led a desperate cavalry charge, a tactic unusual for Vikings who typically fought on foot, that shattered the Saxon momentum and turned near defeat into overwhelming victory. This adaptability, this willingness to employ unconventional tactics when conventional ones weren't working, was characteristic of Bjorn's entire military career. But even as the conquest of England was ongoing, Bjorn's ambitions were already extending beyond Britain. He had proven that Vikings could raid anywhere if they were willing to take the risks and do the planning. The Mediterranean expedition had been incredibly profitable and had made him famous throughout Europe. Why stop? Why not establish permanent Viking presence in these wealthy southern regions? Around 870 AD, Bjorn conducted a second Mediterranean expedition, though this one is less well documented in the sources and may have been smaller in scale. He returned to some of the territories he had raided before, but now with different purposes. Rather than just hit-and-run raids, he attempted to establish more permanent Viking settlements in Sicily and southern Italy. These attempts were largely unsuccessful, meeting fierce resistance from both Muslim and Christian forces who were now better prepared for Viking tactics. By the mid-870s, Bjorn began transitioning from raider and warrior to ruler and statesman, a transformation that many Vikings attempted but few successfully achieved. He had accumulated immense wealth from his various expeditions, wealth that he now deployed strategically to build political power rather than simply enjoying it. He had sons who were growing into warriors themselves, the next generation that would carry forward the family legacy. And he began to think about legacy in fundamentally different terms, not just about the raids and battles he would be remembered for, but about what he would leave behind for future generations, about building something that would outlast his own mortality. He established himself as king in Sweden, ruling territories around what is now Uppsala, though the exact mechanism by which he achieved this royal status is frustratingly unclear in the historical sources. The transition from raider to king was never simple or straightforward in Viking society. There was no formalized succession, no clear rules about who could claim kingship. Instead, it was a combination of military power, wealth that could buy loyalty, reputation that could intimidate rivals, family connections that could provide legitimacy, and political skill that could navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that characterize Scandinavian politics. Bjorn had all of these assets. His military reputation was unmatched. His victories in the Mediterranean and England had proven his capabilities as a commander. His wealth was enormous, allowing him to host lavish feasts, provide generous gifts to potential supporters, and maintain a large personal warband that could enforce his will. His parentage connected him to Ragnar Lothbrok's legendary line, giving him a claim to legitimacy that other would-be kings lacked. And he had learned political skills through decades of navigating Viking power structures, understanding how to build coalitions, when to compromise and when to stand firm, how to turn potential enemies into reluctant allies. As king, Bjorn proved surprisingly effective and successful, bringing stability and prosperity to territories that had been fractious and constantly warring before his rule. He established a system of laws and justice that, while harsh by modern standards, was considered fair by Viking measures. He settled disputes between rival jarls before they could escalate into destructive feuds. He encouraged trade, understanding that economic prosperity strengthened his kingdom more surely than military victories. He built defensive fortifications that protected his territories from raids, understanding from painful experience how devastating such attacks could be. He was particularly innovative in his approach to defense and military organization. Having spent his life as a raider, he understood exactly how raiders thought and operated, what vulnerabilities they looked for, what defenses were effective, and what were merely theatrical. He established a system of coastal watchtowers that could spot approaching ships and warn inland settlements, giving people time to prepare defenses or flee to safety. He maintained a ready response force that could mobilize quickly when raids were detected, arriving in time to actually engage the raiders rather than simply arriving after the damage was done. These seem like obvious measures now, but in 9th century Scandinavia, they were innovative approaches that dramatically improved his kingdom's security. He also worked systematically to establish his sons in positions of authority and influence, understanding that his own legacy would be measured not just by what he personally achieved, but by what his descendants could build upon. He arranged strategic marriages for his children, connecting his family to other powerful Scandinavian families, creating a network of alliances that would outlast his own lifetime. He granted his sons territories to rule, giving them experience in administration and leadership while he was still alive to provide guidance and correct mistakes. This careful preparation paid dividends, as his bloodline continued to hold power and influence in Sweden for several generations after his death. He had spent his youth trying to escape his father's shadow, had spent his middle years establishing his own legendary reputation, and now, in his later years, he was focused on creating a legacy that his own children could build upon. Bjorn Ironside died around 890 AD, probably in his 60s, which was quite old for a Viking warrior of his time. The manner of his death is not clearly recorded, but given that he survived into old age, it seems he died peacefully rather than in battle. He was buried in a large mound at Håga, near Uppsala, a burial befitting a king and legendary warrior. His legacy was immense and multifaceted, extending far beyond his individual achievements to influence the entire trajectory of the Viking Age. On one level, he had achieved exactly what he set out to do as a young man burning with ambition and desperate to escape his father's overwhelming shadow. He had stepped completely out of Ragnar Lothbrok's shadow, had accomplished things that even the legendary Ragnar never achieved, had established his own reputation that would last not just for years, but for centuries. The Mediterranean expeditions alone, those impossible journeys to the ends of the known world, would have been enough to guarantee his place in the sagas and in history. But beyond his individual achievements, Bjorn represented something larger and more significant about the Viking Age itself and about human capability more generally. He demonstrated that Vikings were not just raiders and destroyers, the barbarian scourge that Christian chroniclers portrayed them as, but also explorers and innovators of the highest order. The journey to the Mediterranean required not just raw courage, though that was certainly necessary, but also sophisticated seamanship that could handle unfamiliar waters, navigation skills that worked in regions where Norse techniques had never been tested, planning and logistics capabilities that could sustain a fleet for years away from home bases, and adaptability that could allow Scandinavian warriors to operate successfully in completely alien environments. His success encouraged other Vikings to think bigger, to consider targets and opportunities beyond the traditional raiding grounds of England and Francia that had occupied Norse attention for generations. After Bjorn's Mediterranean expeditions, Vikings became more ambitious and wide-ranging in their reach. They eventually established permanent settlements from Iceland in the west to Russia in the east, from Greenland in the north to Sicily in the south. They served as elite guards for Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, traded with Arab merchants in the Middle East, explored the coast of North America centuries before Columbus. Bjorn had proven that the entire world was potentially accessible to those who were brave enough, skilled enough, and determined enough to venture forth into the unknown. The Mediterranean expeditions also had more immediate practical effects on Viking capabilities and knowledge. The warriors who returned brought back not just wealth and glory, but also knowledge. New shipbuilding techniques learned from Mediterranean vessels. New combat tactics observed in battles against Moorish and Byzantine forces. New navigation methods. New understanding of distant geographies and cultures. This knowledge spread through Scandinavian society, raising the overall sophistication of Viking seafaring and military operations. Future expeditions benefited from what Bjorn's warriors learned, just as Bjorn had benefited from the accumulated wisdom of earlier generations. In the sagas and legends that were composed in the generations after his death, Bjorn Ironside became a symbol of the ideal Viking, combining seemingly contradictory qualities in one remarkable individual. He had the physical courage necessary for a warrior culture that valued bravery above almost everything else. But he also had the intelligence and planning capability that transformed raw courage into actual achievement. He had the ambition that drove him to attempt the impossible. But he also had the wisdom to prepare meticulously rather than just charging ahead recklessly. He had the ability to fight when fighting was necessary. But he also had the judgment to lead, to make decisions that affected thousands of lives, to think strategically about long-term consequences rather than just immediate victories. He was the warrior who could navigate unknown seas, the raider who could plan complex operations, the leader who could inspire men to follow him into the complete unknown. The nickname Ironside itself became legendary, interpreted in different ways by different sources. Some claimed it referred to his exceptional endurance, his ability to withstand hardships that would break other men. Others said it meant that his luck was so strong that enemy weapons couldn't harm him, that he seemed invulnerable in battle. Still, others suggested it meant his determination was unbreakable, that no setback could discourage him or turn him from his chosen path. Whatever the exact origin of the name, it captured something essential about Bjorn. He was hard, unyielding, determined. He had set out to achieve something impossible and had done it. He had refused to accept the limitations that others assumed were absolute. He had looked at the Mediterranean Sea, thousands of miles from his homeland, and decided that distance didn't matter if you wanted something badly enough and were willing to do the work to achieve it. His relationship with his parents remained complex throughout his life. He maintained contact with Lagertha even after choosing to stay with Ragnar, respecting both parents and taking lessons from each. When Ragnar died, Bjorn was devastated, but also, perhaps, finally free from the comparison that had driven him for so long. He could grieve his father as a son rather than as a competitor for historical legacy. His relationships with his brothers evolved over the years. With Ivar, there was always tension, two strong personalities with different approaches to leadership and different visions of success. With Fitzurk, there was genuine affection and partnership. The brotherhood of Ragnar's sons became a significant force in Viking Age politics, sometimes united in common cause, sometimes fractured by competition and different ambitions. Bjorn's descendants would play important roles in Scandinavian history for several generations. His bloodline continued, his wealth and lands were passed down, his reputation provided his children and grandchildren with status and opportunities. He had achieved not just personal fame, but had established a dynasty. Modern historians and archaeologists continue to study Bjorn Ironside, trying to separate historical fact from legendary embellishment. The Mediterranean expeditions are well attested in multiple sources, both Norse sagas and contemporary Arabic and Christian chronicles, so those are generally accepted as historical fact. His role in the Great Heathen Army is similarly well documented. His rule in Sweden is more controversial among historians, with some questioning whether he was actually king or whether that title was added by later saga writers to enhance his status. The famous burial mound at Håga was excavated in the 19th century and again in the 20th, revealing a lavish burial with weapons, treasures, and signs of high status. While we cannot be absolutely certain that the person buried there was Bjorn Ironside, the location, the time period, and the richness of the burial all match what we would expect for someone of his legendary status. What makes Bjorn's story particularly compelling for modern audiences is how universal his core struggle was. The need to step out of a famous parent's shadow, to establish your own identity, to prove yourself on your own terms rather than living in someone else's reflected glory. These are human experiences that transcend time and culture. Bjorn faced these challenges in the context of 9th century Viking society. But the emotional core of his journey resonates with anyone who has ever felt the weight of impossible expectations or the need to prove themselves. His solution to this problem was characteristically Viking. Go farther, raid harder, achieve more than anyone thought possible. Where a modern person might handle parental expectations through therapy or choosing a completely different career path, Bjorn decided to sail to the Mediterranean and raid Rome. The scale might be different, but the underlying impulse to define yourself through your own achievements rather than your parents' legacy is timeless. The story of Bjorn Ironside also raises interesting questions about ambition, success, and what we're willing to sacrifice for fame and achievement. Bjorn achieved everything he set out to achieve. He became legendary, surpassed his father's achievements, established his own reputation. But the cost was high. Years away from home, countless warriors who followed him and died in pursuit of his ambitions, relationships strained or broken, a life spent in constant danger and hardship. Was it worth it? Bjorn would probably have said yes without hesitation. But it's a question worth pondering. His story reminds us that the Viking Age was not monolithic, that individual Vikings had different motivations, different dreams, different ways of approaching the world. Bjorn was a raider, certainly, but he was also an explorer, an innovator, a leader who inspired men to attempt the impossible. He was capable of tremendous violence, as all successful Vikings were, but also of careful planning, of thinking strategically about long-term goals, of adapting to completely unfamiliar environments. From the boy who grew up in the shadow of legendary parents, to the old king who watched his own children grow into warriors, from the shores of Denmark to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. And back again, Bjorn Ironside lived a life that embodied the best and worst of the Viking Age. He was ambitious to the point of recklessness, brave to the point of foolhardiness, determined to the point of obsession. But he was also capable, intelligent, and ultimately successful in achieving goals that would have seemed impossible to a more reasonable person. This was Bjorn Ironside, son of legends, explorer of distant seas, raider of Rome, king of Sweden, father of a dynasty. The man who looked at the impossible distance to the Mediterranean and saw only an opportunity, who faced the crushing weight of his parents' fame and used it as motivation rather than letting it crush him, who proved that Viking capabilities extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. His iron resolve bent the world to his will, and his name still echoes through history more than 1,000 years after his death. If you enjoyed this epic saga of the Viking who sailed farther than anyone before him, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of the greatest warriors history has ever known. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another legendary tale. Which Viking legend should we explore next? Harald Hardrada's final battle? Freydis Eriksdottir's American adventure? Eric the Red's Greenland saga? Your voice shapes our sagas. Until next time, may your journeys be bold and your legacy eternal. Skål.